Hello and welcome back to AP Human Geography. This is the second part of our conversation about overexploitation, and in this segment we're going to focus on land and water resources, and that's really what we've been talking about in terms of usage in our agriculture unit, but now we really kind of want to focus on the things that occur when you are overusing your land and your water resources. So land and water, and again, don't forget, we'll talk about fossil fuels and mineral resources later on in the course. Okay, so when we look at the potential land use capabilities, you'll see that there's actually a lot of land that is not productive, right? And that's going to be all of that brown land, the dark brown. And then the tan stuff here, the kind of pinky tan, this is stuff that is good for grazing. You can grow cereals on it, but it's very marginal. And so what that means is that it requires a lot of fertilizer, a lot of water diversion, and overall that's going to be problematic when you're talking about environmental stuff. And so this light green stuff is going to be your cropland that has to be improved. That means added, fertilizers, things like that. And then this dark green, which there's some, there's a lot, but not enough to feed the entire world. This is where you have your really productive crop, pasture, and forest land. And then these little kind of, sickly green color, this is going to be stuff that you can do forest and tree crops or permanent pastures, and you can see this is all right around the equator. This is a lot to these areas in here where your slash and burn is occurring in this forest area and in the mainly and mostly suitable for forest areas. And then this stuff up here, right, this other forest area, these are the big boreal forests. These are the ones that are managed that we talked about in our last conversation. But what you really get from looking at this map is the bulk of the land in the world is not awesome, right? It's mostly marginal and has to really, really be improved. And improving that causes all kinds of problems. And so when we look at the ecosystems that are best for agriculture, you are also looking at the ecosystems that have lost the most natural habitat. And that's going to be your tropical forests, number one. Then your grasslands, both tropical, well, actually there's three grasslands, your flooded, your wetlands, and then your tropical and subtropical grasslands. This is like the Serengeti, places like that, the Pampas. And then over here, your temperate grasslands. This is like the United States, right? Our Great Plains, the big prairies. And all of these areas, they're losing, but they're losing less in terms of native habitat because these are all pretty useful by themselves, and so there's not a lot of conversion. You may see some forestry going on. Over here, you might see some Mediterranean farming, things like that. And then, of course, in deserts, you really can't do a whole lot, although some of this is lost to urban, right? So a lot of this stuff is going to be lost to urban. This is mostly lost to agriculture. So we look at land area changed by area, okay? You can see that everywhere, lots and lots of natural habitat has become something else. A lot of it's become pasture, but more of it has actually become farm, right? Cultivated farm, growing crops, things like that. And in the rainforest, they've actually converted pasture that used to be used for livestock into agriculture, right? And so they're losing land for pasture. And then in these areas, you've got kind of an equal, right? There's a lot of slash and burn going on here for both. A lot of slash and burn for this, some slash and burn for that, right? So this is going to be those northern grasslands, by the way. And so they're really only good for pasture. The other has to be really improved to grow crops. Okay, so when you look at arable land, and the title of this graph is actually arable land per capita is decreasing, you can see that everywhere in the world you have this decrease, and it's for two reasons. One, you have a big population growth, and two, we are degrading land and we're pushing more into marginal land, and so you kind of get this balance between loss of productivity in your really good arable land and growing things more in your marginal lands. But that's temporary, because those marginal lands are also going to be degraded over time, and then you really won't be able to use those. And that brings us to the conversation about soil degradation. And you can see all over the world, most of the soil that is in any of these productive areas is at the very least degraded, if not very, very degraded. And where is this? Oh, that's right, that's the Great Plains. This is our breadbasket right here. You're looking at China's breadbasket. You're looking at India's breadbasket. So you're talking about the three most populous countries in the world who have very degraded soil that has to be constantly improved. And so we're using more and more and more inorganic fertilizers, more and more and more water. And this is a huge, huge problem. The other reason that you get soil degradation, by the way, is salinization. And I briefly mentioned that in the first part of this, but remember, soil salinization occurs because of irrigation. When you have standing water on fields, that water will evaporate, and what is left behind is the salt. And so you get salt buildup in the soils, and anything that is not salt tolerant will not grow, and that is most of your grains and fruits and vegetables. And so you really, just by farming, make the soil not good, right? And then the other thing too is about erosion. When you start cutting down these root systems for these big trees and things like that, you're going to actually get erosion. And when your crops are in the field, it's okay. But when you harvest, you now have this big empty field, and it'll dry up, and wind blows everything away. And tillage practices are not good for soil conservation by and large, and we'll talk about that too in depth. But that causes erosion, and so this is what you get left with, this little map of soil degradation. The other thing too is that we're using all of our water. And there is water scarcity in areas that you would expect, right? I mean, you expect not to have water in these areas that are desert, and that is unsurprising. But the fact is that you are starting to have these areas of economic water scarcity, these places where you may have water, but it's not enough to do all of the things that you need to do with it. It's not enough to farm. It's not enough for all of the people. And so you end up with this kind of economic water scarcity as opposed to just a straight up physical scarcity. And I'd also like to point out that the reason that there's little or no water scarcity in all of these other places, especially developed nations, say Australia, and then southern China, which is developing but more developed than others, in Europe and Northern Asia, these industrialized countries, some of the more developed countries in South America, and then of course the United States, the reason that there's little or no water scarcity is because we pump it like mad out of the ground, and we divert our rivers. The Colorado River in the United States, which actually flows through this kind of area of physical water scarcity, never actually gets to Mexico anymore because we take all of the water out of it. Now, just as an aside, because we take all the water out, we built a desalinization plant for the people who live around the mouth of the Colorado River, because we do take it all out. So that was kind of our way of saying, here is our compensation for you. So but the fact is that causes issues all along the river, not just across the border. So the other thing that you're going to see is this intensive agriculture. Intensive agriculture really does allow for large populations for two reasons. One, you really are exploiting the land to its maximum, and you can do that in extensive agriculture too, but you're also employing lots of people, and so people have jobs. So you have this great combination of food production and jobs, and that is going to lead to environmental degradation from the agriculture itself, and it's also going to lead to environmental degradation because you have a large population that's not making huge amounts of money, so they're in poverty, but they do have some jobs, and so it seems like a good thing to do, to continue having these jobs available through intensive agriculture. The other thing that you see is that intensive agriculture oftentimes leads to monoculture, which is specialization in crops, and this is going to be especially true on plantations and for cash crops in general. But you'll also see that there are certain foods that are grown, and we lose this dietary diversity. And when you look at all of the foods that are available to us, you're not even getting the full range, because bananas, for instance, you can really buy 3 kinds of bananas. There aren't just 3 kinds of bananas in the world, but those are the ones that are grown commercially. You have the yellow bananas that we're used to. You have the plantains, which are exotic and fun and more expensive. And then you have those little red cream or ladyfinger bananas. And those are also the boutique bananas and exotic bananas. But there are really all kinds of other things that are available out there. We just don't grow them anymore. And that has led to the loss of many what are called cultivars or varieties of food. And that's one of the reasons that the heirloom foods actually are so popular these days, is people are bringing back these foods that used to be available prior to World War II. And we've talked about that with the Green Revolution. But prior to World War II, and they're bringing them back to kind of bring in genetic diversity and just in general dietary diversity. So when you look at the land and water systems all over the world, everything is at risk in some way. And I'm not going to read these slides to you, and I'm not going to specifically go over them. What I really want you to do is I want you to read them, and I want you to match up in your mind why these things are happening, looking at highlands and semi-arid areas. Highlands, by the way, are the colder areas where you have, well, it's not always colder actually, but these higher elevation areas where it's harder for trees to grow. So that's the highlands. And then the semi-arid tropics, right, you can see you're looking at more scrub and desert areas, tropical grasslands. And you've got your subtropical, which leads into temperate. But what I want to call your attention to is the repetition of all of these things: erosion, desertification, right? Crop failure, conflict, poverty, runoff, right? Increased runoff, reduced rainfall, increased droughts, right? Land fragmentation. All of these things are over and over and over again. Aquifer depletion, right? Pollution of soils, loss of biodiversity, right? More pollution, loss of buffer role. This is actually an interesting one right here. Rice paddies can actually absorb water, but if you have cut away if you've cut away all of the trees and all of that good stuff, it doesn't work as well. And we'll talk about this more when we specifically talk about rice. The other thing too is that you're going to start to see price changes, and so the values of the land are going to change, and then you lose things that used to be there, right? And then you can actually take all of this, not just in agriculture, but you can move it into rangelands and forests. And we've already talked about forests, but rangelands are where all of our pastoral groups live. And you're going to have the same things: food insecurity, desertification, right? Poverty, conflict. And it's just all of these things over and over and over again. And they are consistent among all of these systems when you're talking about overexploitation of land and water. And all in all, this makes us pretty bad neighbors. And what you're looking at here is a deer who is eating corn stalks. This is actually stover. It's what's left over after you harvest the corn. But eating the crops. And this deer actually comes in when there's corn there. And so we think that all of these animals are the bad neighbors. They're coming in, they're eating our stuff. We have to protect our foods from all of these animals. But really what they're doing is simply trying to survive. We have destroyed their natural habitat. And so all they're doing is coming into the place that used to be theirs and exploiting it the best that they can. So you have to think about who's really the bad neighbor there. And the other economic thing that we want to talk about, so that's an environmental thing, but the economic thing is going to be about price, right? Real food, right? When we're talking about this, okay, let's start over with that. We're talking about real situations here. We're talking about real areas. We're talking about real losses of land and crop yield. And that translates for you and me and everyone you know to an increase in food costs. And that's going to be for a number of reasons. But if you look across the board, anything that's going to be involved with grain in some way is definitely going to go up, especially if it's involved with corn, okay? And that's where your livestock is going up, and you know, your milk products, any dairy, right, is going to go up because of this whole corn issue. And part of this has to do with biofuels, which we'll talk about later on. And then part of it's just it's more expensive. Corn is a fairly difficult thing to grow without lots of input. But you're also seeing your rice and all of your other crops, and that's because you're going to have to work harder to get food, and it's going to be scarcer, and so it will be more expensive, supply and demand. And when we look at the things that are happening now, I talked about Easter Island in part 1. And now we're going to talk about the Mayan civilization, because they collapsed for the same reasons. Easter Island was a very small area, and it was a small population. This was a large population. And so what I want us to do is think about all of these things that have occurred and are occurring now, and see, did they occur in these civilizations that I've mentioned that have collapsed because of loss of resources. And so what you're going to do is you're going to watch a video that actually maps out, it's where did it come from, about the Mayan civilization, and it actually maps out the amazing engineering that went into building this empire and sustaining this very large area and large group of people. I mean, this was really, really incredible. And then what actually happened as you started having this conflict between population growth and resource availability, especially water, right? Especially water. So anyway, so we're going to watch about that. And I want you to be thinking about our modern society while we're doing that. So if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about just now, please make sure that you ask in class, and I will see you next time.